Good evening, and welcome to Worse, Stories of Strength and Inspiration from the Old Days. I'm James Michael Reilly, your host, and here to remind you that times are tough, but we'll get through this. We've been through worse. Tonight, we'll be looking at the bridge at Remagen, tough theater jobs, and Nitroglycerin Factory. All right, while we're talking, I'm going to be having a Bold Rock hard cider made with apples picked in North Carolina and Virginia. And I'll be having a little bit of turkey pepperoni while we talk. So you want to stop this for a minute, grab something to eat and drink, sit down, we'll get started. In 1969, as you know, there's still a lot of people, millions of people alive who were veterans of World War II. So it was a time when World War II themed movies still had a very strong audience of people who could identify with their stories. And one of the movies that came out that year was The Bridge at Remagen. It had an all-star cast: George Segal, Ben Gazzara, E.G. Marshall, and it told the story of a famous battle toward the end of World War II, happened in March of 1945. Now, at that time, everyone except perhaps Hitler knew that Germany was going to lose the war. The Allies were breaking into Germany on both fronts. So from the east, the Soviets were advancing into Germany, and from the west, the British, Americans, and French were advancing. So in the west, as the British, Americans, and French advanced, a major obstacle was the Rhine River, which is in places about 1,200 feet wide. It's deep. It runs swiftly. It does not lend itself to the quick building of temporary bridges to move an army across so that their advance could continue. There were existing at that time 40 permanent bridges across the Rhine, railroad bridges, road bridges, what have you. And the Germans had equipped these with explosives so that as they retreated after the last of their forces moved across it to the eastern side into the heart of Germany, they could blow the bridges up. So having looked at the terrain, the Allies determined that they would cross the Rhine either north or south of Remagen, or both, because in the place where the bridge at Remagen was, the banks of the river were too steep to easily get an army across. And of course, the assumption was the bridge would be blown. So that was not considered to be the most active part of the front. There was a unit left there. That was the 9th Armored Division. It was called the Phantom Division because the Germans had repeatedly and erroneously reported that they had destroyed it. So in some ground forces associated with the 9th Armored Division, there was a company of soldiers commanded by a guy named Lieutenant Karl Timmermann. And hearing that name, I'm reminded of a joke that was made during the first Gulf War by the writer Fran Lebowitz, who was talking about the leader of the U.S. forces during the first Gulf War. His name was Schwarzkopf. She said, "I can't believe he's on our side." Well, one may be excused for thinking that even more strongly when you're talking about someone fighting for the Americans, crossing the Rhine River, invading Germany, whose name is Karl Timmermann. But that was the case. So Lieutenant Timmermann and his company approached the bridge, expecting it to be blown up at any moment. And sure enough, explosions went off. The bridge was surrounded by smoke, and when the smoke cleared, the bridge was damaged, but it was still there. So they very rapidly got in touch with their superiors, who said, "Hot dog, get as many people across it as you can." In fact, I think Omar Bradley literally said hot dog or hot damn when he heard about this news. So looking at it from the other side, the head of bridge security for the Germans was a guy named Captain Willy Bratke. Now, he said the reason that the bridge didn't blow up, he was not given enough or the right kind of explosives. He requested 600, I'm sorry, I don't know if it's kilos or pounds. Let's say it was kilos, 600 kilos of military explosives, and he was given 300 kilos of commercial explosives. Some other people say that the fighting caused one of the wires to become damaged that was intended to provide the electrical charge to blow up some of the explosives, and that's why the bridge was not completely destroyed. But looking back to the history of the bridge, there's an interesting little light that might be shed on all of this. Its real name was the Ludendorff Bridge. Ludendorff was a German general of World War I. Now, when I read that, my thought was, why would they name a bridge after a military leader of a war that they lost? But then I found out the Ludendorff Bridge was built between 1916 and 1919. So most of it was built when the Germans, while World War I was going on, when they didn't know what the outcome was going to be yet. So at that time, Ludendorff, who by the end of the war had risen to be head of all the German forces, at least in the Western theater, was still considered a hero. So it makes sense they name it after him. Also, the bridge was built in large part by captured Russian prisoners that the Germans had captured in their war in the East. So when the time came at the end of World War II to blow it up, lo and behold, there's another platoon of captured people working there. In this case, a group of Polish prisoners being forced to work under conditions approaching slave labor to work on the bridge just before its capture. It had been a railroad bridge, but the Germans needed it to function as a road bridge to get wheeled vehicles and troops across it. So the Polish soldiers were laying boards across the tracks. While they were doing this work, they were living in the railroad tunnel that was just beyond the bridge. And so you can imagine what their lives were like. It was in March. They were living in a tunnel and doing this work, all the while wondering what was being done to their homeland hundreds and hundreds of miles away. Uh, one of them, one of these Polish prisoners, told a guy who wrote a story of it in 1957 called The Bridge at Remagen, an author named Ken Hexler, told him that a friend of his had cut the wires. So it was ironic that a bridge built by prisoners from an earlier German conquest was possibly preserved by the actions of a group of prisoners from a later German conquest. So the Americans were able to fight their way across the bridge. They were backed up by tanks from the 9th Armored, the Phantom Division. And on the way across, they cut every wire they could see just in case it might still be possible for the Germans to blow it up. The first American across it was Sergeant Alex Drabick, and he was followed shortly thereafter by the first officer to cross the bridge, Lieutenant Carl Timmerman. So that night, far away in Nebraska, Carl Timmerman's mother, Mary, was working at the Goldenrod Cafe, and she got a long distance phone call. Now, I have heard parents say that one of the calls you're most frightened of getting is one that begins with, now he's fine. But so I cannot imagine what it's like for a military mother to get a long distance call at a time when long distance calls were expensive and rare, when she had not only one but two sons fighting in the war. So the person on the other end said that it was the Omaha World Herald calling. And she said, how is Carl? And he said, he's fine. But he said, your son is the first officer of an invading army to cross the Rhine River since Napoleon. And Mary responded, Napoleon, I don't care about. How is my Carl? So at this point, after the Americans had taken the bridge, they were attacked by a weapon most of them had never seen before. And for that part of the story, I will turn to the first person account of my uncle, William McAllister, who was serving in the war and who is still alive today. I hope to interview him for a later segment. He arrived at the bridge shortly after it had been taken by the Americans, and he said that the Americans had set up anti-aircraft guns up and down the river on both sides, about every 100 yards. And then he found out why. I don't know if you have ever heard of an aircraft called the Me-262, but it's famous in the history of aviation for being the first jet. The Germans, even at this late stage in the war, when they were clearly going to lose, late in the war, put into air the first jets in the world. Thank God we beat them when we did. The Me-262 was a jet fighter. And I discovered how much the fact that the Germans sent some Me-262s to knock out the bridge at Remagen has taken hold of the popular imagination. I searched Me-262s at Remagen. Almost the entire first two page of results were art prints, paintings of the event, some of them quite beautiful, some of them quite expensive, but it gave me a sense of how important this has become in people's imaginations. There was a master's student in the late 90s working at the University of Calgary. His name was Sterling Michael Pavelik, and I want to thank him for having his master's thesis published online. Its name is German Jet Program, 1939 to 1945. He offered an insight that I had not known before. There were two kinds of German jets at Remagen. One was the Me-262 I just mentioned. That was the fighter cover for the Arado AR-234 jet bomber. I had never even heard of that before. My uncle, as I said, was there. He saw these planes go over, and he said, I don't know how fast they were going, but they were going faster than anything I had ever seen before. The other thing he said was that the Americans are so determined to hold these bridges that when these jets came over, so much anti-aircraft fire went up in the air that he had to get into a doorway to stop being hit from hot shrapnel that was raining out of the sky. So one account I've read said the air attacks did some damage to the bridges, but a German account said no, it did not. Nothing got close. That he said the closest thing anything got was that the Germans fired a V-2 rocket at it, and it landed 200 yards away. A V-2 rocket, another one of their miracle weapons that they hoped would turn the tide of the war late in the war, where years after the Blitz, the London Blitz had ended, more Londoners died late in the war because the Germans were able to fire these incredible inventions, these ballistic missiles from bases in Germany all the way to hit London late in the war. It was like the Germans were so determined to knock out this bridge, they made it a testing ground for their most advanced weapons. But at any rate, between March 7th when it was taken and March 17th when the bridge did ultimately collapse, 25,000 Americans got across in addition to tanks and other supporting vehicles. And the fact that they were able to do that probably accelerated the German defeat. The collapse of the bridge may have resulted from the damages from the explosions that were set off on March 7th, and it may just have been the abuse on the bridge of being used as a transport for things like tanks when it was never built to do that. But I think about it from all the different sides of the players in this story, and all of it sounds unimaginably worse than anything I've experienced. An officer ordered to destroy a part of his nation's infrastructure to stop invaders from getting across. The deprivation of being a slave laborer, living in a tunnel, the fear of a mother getting a long-distance phone call while her sons are away at war. I have enormous respect for the people who have suffered these things. And another thing that's an interesting twist on the story is Karl Timmermann, that American officer who was the first officer to cross the Rhine since Napoleon, was born in Frankfurt, Germany in 1921, and his family immigrated to the United States. It's like they say in the play Hamilton, immigrants, they get the job done. The bridge at Remagen has never been rebuilt. Okay, I want to thank Business Insider, the National World War II Museum, Sterling Michael Pavelik's master's thesis from the University of Calgary, and most of all, my uncle, William McAllister, for his fascinating information on this story and for his service to our country. Yeah, on a lighter note, there's some pretty tough theater jobs out there. So let me tell you about a couple that I've heard about. So the great granddaddy of all outdoor dramas in the United States is in Ohio, and it's called Tecumseh. Tecumseh with an exclamation point. Now, this is a story of a great Shawnee leader who fought to protect his homeland in the late 1700s. I have never seen it. For all I know, it's awesome. It sounds pretty impressive based on what they say on the website. There's a herd of galloping horses in the show. It's amazing what you can do when a show is outdoors. Real cannons firing, huge battle scenes. But having done some outdoor acting of my own, I know that it can be very tough. The elements, the distances that have to be traversed, the things that creative directors demand of you. So I worked with a guy who did this show, Tecumseh, in the early 1990s. Now, when I go on their website now, one of the things I see is it says Native Americans are strongly encouraged to audition. I don't know if that was really part of the message back in the 90s, and I can tell you that I auditioned for Tecumseh around 1990 or 1991, for the role of Tecumseh to play a Native American chief, me. So that gives you an idea of how things were really different back then. At any rate, this friend of mine who did the show was at least as white looking as I was. And he said that he had to wear body makeup head to toe, reapply it daily, and that months after the show ended, he was still sweating it out into his sheets. He described a situation where he had to make an entrance, I'm sure it was very dramatic, where a group of Native American, the characters were Native American men, rose up out of a pond and came toward the audience. But this pond was never cleaned and it had mosquitoes growing in it. And so in addition to the body paint, you were getting covered by this scummy water every night. There's another outdoor drama, also in Ohio, called Blue Jacket. A friend of mine, a colleague, somebody I worked with on another show did that. Now she said, at the time when she did it, the non-union actors in the show made $95 a week. But if you sewed costumes, in addition to acting, they'd give you $125 a week. So she sewed costumes. But the problem was the Native American characters wore leather. So I don't know if you ever tried to sew leather. In their not terribly well-equipped costume shop, they had little home sewing machines. That was her words. And they couldn't take it. So trying to push needles through leather. So needles would frequently break. She said pieces of needle would fly up, they'd hit you in the neck, and you'd say, throat check. And somebody would come over and check to make sure there weren't little pieces of needle sticking out of your neck. And then you go back to work. Throat check, $125 a week. So she was playing both characters that were Caucasian and that were Native American in the same show. So she had to be a Native American woman and then take off enough of the makeup to be a white settler. And then she had to be a Native American boy. And then she had to be a white woman again every night, in addition to having her throat checked for needle scraps while she was doing her job in the daytime. She said there were, in fact, Native American actors in the show, thank God, that knew some of the sign language used by the Shawnee. And this one actor would use it to sign dirty messages. I'm not going to translate them for you, but she said that she noticed the other Native American actors smirking. She asked them what it meant. It was something very offensive. And then the stage manager said to him, you know, we have Native Americans in the audience sometimes. You can't be signing dirty messages on stage during the show. Anyway, for that one, the set was an acre in expanse. Good Lord. And there was one scene where the Native Americans would assault a fort, and they would each approach it with flaming torches and throw the torches over the wall. I'm sure it was extremely dramatic to watch. I said, well, wasn't that really unsafe? She said, well, we had hatches we could get under. But one time a woman forgot to get under a hatch and she got hit in the side of the head with a flaming torch. And then she made the rather pithy observation, most situations are safe if you pay attention. I thought that was very generous of her. So there was another guy, this is one of these things where like a guy knew a guy who was working at an outdoor drama in North Carolina. He was part of the tech crew and he was putting, I guess a storm was approaching. So like the show was stopped or canceled or whatever. And they were up on towers putting covers over the lights, and lightning hit the tower and blew off the lower part of one of his arms. But he said, but he stayed in the business. I think they called him Sparky or something like that. At any rate, look, when I look at people in the business who have had it worse, and especially after our story of the bridge at Remagen, I must readily acknowledge that even a bad day and a bad play is usually easier than a good day for someone who is fighting our nation's wars. Sometimes the worse you're talking about in the case of a play is a situation where it's artistically worse. You may have heard of a play called The Fantastics. It's a famous musical. Its most famous song is "Try to Remember a Kind of September." Okay, so this friend of mine worked on a production with the directors. The director had the brilliant idea that the leads in this beautiful lyrical love story should enter on four-wheelers, you know, ATVs, all-terrain vehicles. And this wasn't an outdoor drama. This was indoors. This was in a normal theater. So one night, the actor playing Louisa, the young female romantic lead, cut the corner roll. And my friend on her headset, she was working in a tech capacity, suddenly heard the stage manager say, "She's over, she's over." And my friend said, "What do you mean she's over?" And said, "She's in the audience." She had rolled her ATV off the front of the stage. So my friend went out there to offer what help she could. Apparently, it had done a complete 360 roll. Fortunately, Luisa was only very badly bruised, but one of the patrons had a big bump on his head. My friend observed him for signs of concussion, and she said it was rising up like a goose egg on his head. Another guy who was in a white shirt and a tie, he had a tire mark going up his stomach and over his shoulder. So all three of these people were taken to the hospital. No one was seriously hurt, but Louisa was bruised for several weeks. I told a friend of mine about it, that idea of putting four-wheelers in the Fantastics, and he said, "Oh, that's a cry for help." That is. Well, as an actor, all stories of four-wheelers aside, I'm the beneficiary of safety rules mandated by my unions. And I would imagine many people in many lines of work are safer or even alive today because of rules insisted upon by their unions. In the case of actors unions, some of the things are like smoke and fog effects on stage, so you're not breathing in poison 8 shows a week. Rigging of harnesses for flying effects. But I can't help but wonder what they did in an era probably before union rules for people working in factories that made nitroglycerin. So the person who made it most famous is the Swedish physicist Alfred Nobel. He patented dynamite in 1867. Now, we think of dynamite as dangerous, which it is. It explodes from impact or concussion. And the classic thing of a lit fuse going to dynamite, it's a little bit misleading, because what the lit fuse is going to is a blasting cap, which is filled with gunpowder. The gunpowder is ignited by the fuse. When the gunpowder explodes, the concussion explodes the dynamite. But let's remember that dynamite is the safe explosive. Nobel got rich because dynamite, in comparison with nitroglycerin, was stable. Now, safety issues. This brings me back to the conditions that workers worked in. I saw a photograph from 1888 of some people working in a dynamite factory in Italy. It was three women, and it just looked like three women sitting at a table. They could have been making sandwiches for lunch, just dressed in corsets and normal dresses, absolutely no safety equipment, feeding cardboard sleeves under a machine that would extrude the contents of dynamite like the contents of a sausage. And la-di-da, there are pictures on the wall. I would imagine if they'd asked for any sort of safety equipment, they probably would have been fired. But nitroglycerin, the forerunner and component of dynamite, was invented by an Italian. I didn't know that until I looked this up. A guy named Ascanio Sobrero in 1847. And then he had a business partner. Then Nobel worked with the business partner. Sobrero had reservations about making nitroglycerin known to the public because it was so dangerous. But Nobel saw the commercial potential of it. And so he produced it on an industrial scale. He went back to Sweden, his home in Sweden, and began to produce Nobel's blasting oil. But his own brother was killed in an explosion at one point. As a result, he was not allowed to make nitroglycerin in the city of Stockholm anymore, so he had to find an outlying area where he began to build a factory. There were some other events in addition to this personal loss that made him realize he had to find a safer alternative. There's an infamous story in a Wells Fargo office in San Francisco in 1866, in which a package containing Nobel's blasting oil was shipped on a ship under a label general merchandise. It started to leak. People began to try to break into the package to find out what was wrong with it. It demolished the building they were in. It blew out windows within a half-a-mile radius. 15 people were killed. Some of the newspaper accounts are so disturbing that I don't even want to repeat them to you. But it was it brought about calls that things become safer, and Nobel was apparently having some sort of moral qualms about this, and that's one of the things that led him to produce um, dynamite. So what happened was, now apparently, uh, in a coincidence, he knocked some nitroglycerin off a table where he was doing experiments, and he continued to experiment with these things himself throughout his life. It hit the floor and it didn't blow up. He looked at what was on the floor and there was a kind of dust, and he started to think that that was part of the reason it didn't explode. So he began to look for things that he could mix nitroglycerin with that would make it less volatile. Um, and he ultimately found a kind of clay, or what is technically called diatomaceous earth, in Germany. It was called Kieselguhr, which could be mixed with nitroglycerin into a paste that was much, much more stable. It didn't lose much of its explosive power when you wanted to detonate it, but it was much less likely to go off accidentally. So he combined Kieselguhr with nitroglycerin, put it into cardboard tubes, sold it as dynamite. He became a very, very wealthy man. He built factories in Germany and Scotland. Nobel had a mansion near Paris, and not far outside of his mansion, he had a laboratory where he could continue to carry on his experiments. He had a wake-up call at one point where a newspaper accidentally ran his obituary, and the obituary called him a merchant of death, and it cited terrorist incidents. You don't think of the late 1800s as a time when there were a lot of terrorists running around, but terrorist incidents involving dynamite. So this motivated him to donate his entire fortune to create the Nobel Foundation, which is the organization that every year for, I don't know how long it's been, around 100 years, has given out the Nobel Prize. And I didn't know this. This is not a bad deal. You win a Nobel Prize, you get about $1 million. So, ironically, nitroglycerin, when it's metabolized by the human body, produces a substance called nitric oxide, not nitrous oxide, laughing gas, but nitric oxide, which dilates blood vessels. So nitroglycerin is also a medicine for chest pain. And late in his life, Nobel was prescribed nitroglycerin by his doctor. Even he, of course, saw the irony of that. So we live in an age when some people feel that regulations are ruining business. Others feel that people's health is being ignored. And I ask everyone to consider what it's like to live in a time when there are almost no rules at all. Explosives to blow out windows in a half-mile radius in a major city were shipped as general merchandise, when your own brother might be blown up as an experiment. I heard a long time ago that there is a nitroglycerin factory from this era that's been preserved as a museum, and you can visit it, but there's only one. There have been several at one point. I'll give you one guess what happened to the others. I want to thank Britannica.com, Nobel.org, Popular Mechanics, Forbes.com, and the Central Pacific Railroad.org. Now, so if you've enjoyed this, consider supporting WORS by liking and subscribing to our channel here. And perhaps visit us on our free Facebook group, which you are very welcome to join, called James Michael Reilly Studios. And also consider supporting our work and the production of this content every week, 5 days a week, various sorts of content to bring about laughs, education, and inspiration by subscribing on Patreon for as little as $3 a week, $3 a month, sorry. Thanks for joining us. We'll get through this, folks. We've been through worse.